Hey Tankers, this is Ace Dawnbach here, back with another video. This time it's something a little bit different from my How To Play series. We're going to take a good look at the different types of ammunition within the game and how all of them work and when you should use them and all the different mechanics that come with these different types of ammunition. This is a common mistake I see with beginning players. They have a tendency to load one specific type of round that is not the best of choices. They just see one mechanic about the round and they briefly look over it and they're like, oh, that's a good choice, and they just use that specific round. And then a situation will come up where they don't have the other round they should be using and they're essentially screwed. So we're going to take a close look at these rounds and I'm explain kind of a little bit of each of how they work, when you should use them, what loadouts you should be using with those types of rounds, etc., etc. So, there is essentially only two different types of rounds. Yes, you heard it. There's really only two different types of rounds within World of Tanks. There's a lot of people that will argue that point, but I'm getting into essentially the primary types of rounds. There's three different subcategories that go underneath those, and I'll explain those in a second, but essentially the two different choices you have are AP or HE. AP being a armor piercing, and HE being a high explosive. Now, here we are looking at two rounds that are of the exact same caliber, a 105mm caliber round. So this is a common round you'll see with tier 10s, and then you have the what's called AP round here, and then you have a HE round here. Now, looking at these rounds, it'll show you the caliber, then it will show you the penetration values, and it'll show you the damage. Now, these numbers, what they essentially mean for penetration is how much armor it can go through, damage, how much damage it will do. These numbers also will vary. There's a high and a low roll, and sometimes when you fire a round, it will vary somewhere in between. Very rarely will you see a low of 176. Very rarely will you see a high of 293. That's where the random game mechanic comes in, and you may get that penetration, you may not. But generally speaking, armor piercing is the most common round, and 80% of the tanks that you use, regular tanks, conventional tanks, will be using an AP round. They're relatively cheap, usually in terms of speaking. They're probably the cheaper round that you'll be using, and is the most common round you'll be using. At the beginning of the game, you should be using AP. They will, generally speaking, penetrate vehicles relatively consistently if you know where to aim of vehicles of the same tier, and they're just relatively the better choice. Every single different type of gun, though, will carry a different mixture of those three different types of rounds, and that's something to be mindful of. Also, every single gun has a different tier, so a tier 9 gun, generally speaking, will perform better than a tier 8 gun, for example. So that's something to be mindful of when you're selecting your ammunition for those different types of rounds. If you're saying, oh no, my AP isn't penetrating, it's probably because you're using either a gun on a tier weapon that is lower than your tank should be, or you're hitting in like armor values or something. The problem with AP rounds, obviously, is that while they are consistent in terms of the damage they do, they are relatively cheap, so if you do damage with them, it's almost guaranteeing that you're going to generate money off of doing a damaging shot. They can bounce, and that comes into knowing where to aim on your target and understanding angles and how to force bounces and those kind of things, but that's not really what I'm going to cover. The point is that AP round is a standard shot. It does basically that. You shoot it, it penetrates, it does damage. It's the round that you should be using, and it should be the mainstay of most of the tanks that you use. Now we go over and we take a close look at the high explosive. There's a little bit of different things that are going on here with high explosive. Now, if you look closely, you can see that high explosive, generally speaking, has a lower penetration value than the equivalent in terms of AP. That's pretty self-explanatory. And the reason why that is just out of balance. When the round hits, it explodes, it does damage. Very rarely are you going to use these rounds as a regular choice. There's some instances when you can, but high explosive is useful for using against light targets, light tanks, artillery pieces, open hatched vehicles that have no armor value in those places. If you fire a high explosive round, you can do a lot of damage in those categories, and as you can see, the damage roll on them is a lot higher. But just this is deceptive though, and this is a common mistake people see with high explosive. They see the higher damage value, and they're just like, ooh, I'll use a ton of high explosive. Bad decision. High explosive doesn't obviously penetrate all the time, and while you always will most of the time do damage with high explosive, it's not going to be a lot. You're not nearly going to do this amount. that's where this burst radius will come in. If a high explosive round doesn't penetrate a vehicle and explodes on the tank, it will splash and do a little bit of damage, but that damage will probably be anywhere from, like, you'll see like a 20 roll or an 8 roll. And if you're wondering how come, if you're using HE and just seeing like these low rolls, which is a common newbie mistake I see in low tier games, this is why. It just is a round that will not go through thick layers of armor and is not useful in that situation. Where using high explosive on regular tanks is useful is if an enemy tank is at such low HP that even if you were to hit them with high explosive, it would be a good choice, opposed to maybe rolling the dice and having the chance of a AP round bouncing. So if I'm in a tank that, is really low on HP and they've bounced a couple of my shots, I'm going to go ahead and load in that 1 HE round and fire and hit them, and regardless of whatever I roll, I probably will do enough damage to kill the target. Just be careful when you're using the HE. You have to be experienced in knowing when you can use that in that situation. And I mean, it literally has to be no life. Like 1% HP, like 5, 6 HP left on an enemy tank, go ahead and finish them off real fast with an HE round. Other than that, you're going to be using that exclusively for open hatch vehicles, light tanks that have low armor values, and artillery pieces. It's generally speaking the rule. So if it's open hatch, those I covered it. So those are the 2 rounds as the basics. Now underneath those, there are several subcategories of rounds, which I'm now going to show you. And here they are. You have, now we're going to discuss the APCR, or Armor Piercing Composite Rigid Round. Now, an AP Composite Rigid Round is basically a more advanced version of an AP round. They function essentially the same way. They have an average roll of damage, they usually aren't higher, and the penetration values on them are a little bit higher than usually, generally speaking, AP round. The reason why I say this is because most of the time, armor-piercing composite rigid rounds are most of the time a premium shell. Now, you probably have seen those, the rounds that actually that cost gold or an obscene amount of credits to fire. These rounds are very good and very good rounds that you should use, but you should not make them the mainstay of your weapon, generally speaking. Because they're so expensive, if you just shoot exclusively armor-piercing composite rigid in place of AP rounds, you are essentially going to be throwing credits away at doing damage for something that could probably consistently do damage here. Using all gold is not a wise choice. You want to generate a revenue. You want to be able to make money so that way you can buy that next cool tank later on. And if you just use gold shells, you're going to be throwing money out the drain. So is it not worth it? Is it not worth using gold premium shells? No. It is worth using premium shells, it's just not worth using it exclusively. And that's where it comes to the whole argument I have, which is that you should bring to bear every single tool you have for your tank. If you understand how the rounds work, then after that point you can kind of vary it up in how you want to use it. But the armor-piercing composite rigid round is one of those times where, let's say you're in a tier 10 match and you're in a tier 8 vehicle, and you're not penetrating with your standard AP against a higher tier vehicle. Then at that time, maybe it'd be a good idea to consider switching in that armor-piercing composite rigid and start shooting those. But don't load the entire tank with it, and just use it in the certain situations where you need that extra penetration to do damage. The next round we're going to look at is the HESH round, which is a variant of the high explosive round. This round I love. It is almost broken, and probably still is broken, even though I think they have tried to nerf it sometimes. What a HESH round essentially does is it's a high explosive round that actually has decent pen. Not necessarily as good penetration as a AP round, for example, but still high enough that you can relatively consistently penetrate for that higher amount of damage. These are great rounds to be using against like the sides of enemy tanks. If you're ambushing an opponent with HESH, it's a great choice. Most tanks that use HESH rounds are probably, I think, the British type vehicles in the high tiers. Otherwise, if you do get an opportunity to use HESH, I love them. They're They work just like a regular high explosive. You can use them on artillery pieces. The rear of enemy tanks you can go through, and high explosive shells have a tendency to do high amounts of damage to crew members, module pieces, and those sorts of things. So you can get extra critical damage on top of doing a high roll. And so for that sense, HESH rounds are great. The thing is, though, is that if they don't penetrate, you're going to also have that same issue that you have with high explosive, where you get a low roll of damage that is essentially nothing, and you've pretty much wasted a shot in terms of doing damage. It's also expensive. It is, generally speaking, most of HESH rounds are premium rounds, so again, they're situational. Don't bring too many of them, and just use them when you need to. Light targets, open hatch vehicles, those sorts of things where you can penetrate sides and rear also can be included in HESH as a viable times when to use those rounds. The final round I have for you is kind of a hybrid between the two, and that is a high explosive anti-tank round, or heat round. Sounds kind of cool. The heat rounds for a long time were really overpowered, but they did nerf these, and I will explain in a second where they were nerfed. But they do not have the burst necessarily damage of a HESH round, for example. But where they do have an explosion. The explosion happens inside after penetration. So it'll hit the tank and then explode. So you can get extra criticals with a HESH round, or excuse me, with a high explosive anti-tank round. So it does crit a little bit more regular than the AP or the APCR rounds do, which is a good thing to have. Other than that, they're pretty much, and they do, generally speaking, they are a premium shell too, but other than that, they are essentially another variant of the AP. That's kind of where they kind of fall in between. They have an explosion, but they don't have the burst, and they don't explode on the outside. They have to penetrate to explode. But where where heat is nerfed is against spaced armor. Now, a good example of that we're going to show my Panzer IV-H. Now, if someone was shooting a high explosive anti-tank at for example, my Panzer IV-H, and as you can see here, there is some spaced armor here, and it was shooting at the sides of my tank. As soon as it hits this spaced armor, it will explode in between the tank and do no damage or bounce. So do not use these tanks on tanks that have spaced armor. They will do literally no damage, and that's where they have balanced the round type. Nonetheless, a very powerful round and something that you should use. As for loadouts with my vehicle, this is actually my Panzer IV is a great example of how you should load out your tank. It does carry a lot of ammunition, so we're just going to jump in here and take a look. You should always carry, obviously, mainly AP. That's the primary round I shoot. I happen to carry 30 of the composite rigid rounds, which are the premium shells. I have a tendency to run into tier 7s inside my Panzer IV on a regular basis, and because those vehicles are 2 tiers higher, I like having a nice collection of those rounds that can actually penetrate that target pretty consistently. And then finally, I have 7 high explosive rounds to be used situationally against artillery pieces, those open hatch vehicles, as we discussed in those kind of situations. As a result, it's a very balanced loadout. I bring every single tool I need to bear, and I can switch those rounds when I need to. That's pretty much it. Another kind of fun little pro tip for if you haven't figured this out, it's kind of a common thing. If you know how to, when you switch ammunition, you can double tap 1 or 2 to quickly switch that round in and beat the reload time. But you can also just tap it once to have it fire through the first round you have loaded and then automatically load that next round in. If you have the perk Intuition, it will immediately load that round in. It's kind of a fun feature that you can go for in your crew perks. It doesn't proc all the time, but when it does, it's kind of nice because then you get that automatic round right away. Just kind of a fun little thing to know. Anyway, guys, if you have any questions about the different types of rounds within the game, if I didn't answer a question or there was some fact that I should have touched basis on that you would like to share, please feel free to leave a comment in the description. Contact me on the World of Tanks forums page. I usually check the forums page pretty regularly. Just get a hold of me as best as you can. Leave a message. I'm really good about checking that stuff. And anyway, thank you so much for watching, and this is Ace Dallenbach signing off.